Right, welcome everyone. Welcome at the sixth edition already, I think, of the Policy Forum series here at VUB, Brussels School of Governance. I'm Jan Orbi. I'm at Ghent University, actually, but I collaborate also with VUB now and then. And I was asked to coordinate a session in this series on the trade development nexus, trade sustainable development nexus. And to be honest, the original idea was to do something on economic partnership agreements, because these economic partnership agreements, these trade deals have dominated and the trade development debates for many years, decades even. But then it became clear that maybe it would be interesting to focus on something slightly different, to look at the critical Raw Materials Act and the strategic partnerships with the external dimensions of the raw materials policy of the EU, which are maybe, strictly speaking, not trade agreements, although, of course, today, what is trade? Everything has become a bit blurred. I think that will be clear also today. Trade, development, security, climate. I think there's a lot of scope for coherence when we talk about these issues, and I think these strategic partnerships are also really very important to follow up. So the goal today is, first of all, descriptive, just to learn more about these partnerships, and secondly, also normative, of course, also to learn more about how they can be evaluated, what are the pitfalls, what are the challenges, what are the opportunities, and how should we overall think about these strategic partnerships. I think we have an impressive lineup of speakers. We have 6 speakers, so we will have to try to be brief so that there's also time for Q&A and maybe some discussion at the end. So you will see that all the speakers have a very distinctive expertise on this topic. They come from different corners, so to say. And without further ado, I will already start briefly introducing the first speaker. So Helena Maria Cavaco Viegas is at the European Commission, where she is Senior Policy Officer, Energy Intensive Industries and Raw Materials Unit, which is a DG Internal Market, or more widely DG Internal Market, Industry, Entrepreneurship and SMEs. So Helena, you have the floor.
Okay, so thank you very much for your introductory words. So I don't need to introduce myself again. So, and thank you for the invitation, for being here with you today for this Policy Forum series. So, it's no novelty for anyone that there is a global commitment to go through the energy transition, and in the EU in particular, we are committed to with the green and digital transition that the energy transition is part for, and for this we will need a lot of raw materials, minerals, metals, because the new energy paradigm is raw material intensive. Mm-hmm. So, and when we say raw materials here, we mean the non-energy, non-agricultural raw materials. So it's not the fuel raw materials. So we will need a lot of these raw materials for these purposes, and also for other important sectors as aerospace, as defense. So many sectors need in our society need raw materials. So raw materials are high in the political agenda globally. Being it for the countries that have their economies depending on the production of these raw materials, or for all the countries that are committed with this transition. So, at the same time, it's no novelty for anyone that the EU is very dependent on raw materials. So, putting all these drivers together, we adopted the European Critical Raw Materials Act. That is the first EU ever regulation on raw materials, and it is the basis for building up the EU capacity and strengthening the resilience of its critical raw material supply chains. And it includes measures to strengthen the domestic supply chains and the domestic capacity production, and to reinforce international engagement to develop mutually beneficial partnerships with third countries. So we've seen the internal dimension. We will want to produce more within the EU. This is why we set some benchmarks for up to 2030 that we would like to meet, where we would like that we can produce we can at least extract 10% of the total consumption of the EU at that stage of the value chain, 40% of processing or refining, and 25% on the recycling side. We also have as a benchmark that we do not depend more than 65% from one single country whenever this is possible, because for some commodities this may not be the case, and here I could bring, for example, the PGMs, certain PGM metals. So on the external dimension, one of the important components, and that I believe it's the reason why I was invited here today, are the partnerships we are developing with third countries that are resource-rich countries. And I will first say what these partnerships are not about, before I say what they are about. So these partnerships are not trade instruments and are not legally binding agreements. This is important to know. And another very important thing to know about what these partnerships are not is these are not partnerships about mining. These are partnerships that cover the entire raw materials value chain, from exploration to extraction, processing, refining, and recycling. And sometimes, if it's the interest of the partner country, the partnerships could even combine other sectors. I can give, for example, the example of the partnership with Namibia, where the partnership combines raw materials value chains with green hydrogen. The idea of this cooperation model with the third countries to support the EU to bring its resilience on the raw materials supply chains started actually in September 2020, when we adopted the Action Plan for Critical Raw Materials, and we announced as action number 9 the development of partnerships with resource-rich countries, being it developed or developing countries. We even pointed at certain priority countries for starting the partnerships. And actually, our first partnership was established in June 2021 with Canada, and immediately in July followed the partnership with Ukraine. And for the moment, we have a network of 13 partnerships. Then, of course, because the partnerships are an important action in the external dimension of the raw materials policy, we decided to strengthen this action, and the partnerships became part of the Critical Raw Materials Act. And if you look at Article 37, then you will see the context for these partnerships. The partnerships have have a model that are based usually on 3 pillars when they are developed with developed countries, but they have a more complex approach, a 5-pillar approach, if we develop it with a developing country or emerging economy. So basically, all partnerships have a pillar that it is a business-oriented pillar that has the aim of developing industrial projects along the raw materials value chain, support exploration, support mining projects, but also mineral beneficiation, refining, and recycling. Those projects are part of this pillar. The second pillar is about cooperation on research and innovation along the raw materials value chain, because it is of interest of the EU, and it has been so far a pillar that all the partner countries we have committed to. It's a strong interest for cooperation on research and innovation, so it is possible to advance technologically on more environmentally friendly technologies for the raw materials value chain. And then, because sustainability is as important for us as security of supply, there is a third pillar that it is about alignment on environmental, social, and governance criteria and standards with the partner country. So these 3 pillars are common so far to all partnerships, but the partnerships with developing countries also have 2 other very important pillars that can support these countries to meet their ambition of not being only exporters of ores, and many times not even ore concentrates, but to go further down in the value chain. And for this, we bring 2 these additional pillars, that one is the deployment of infrastructure for the development of industrial projects, again, along the raw materials value chain, and I insist on this point. And this infrastructure can be hard infrastructure or soft infrastructure to allow to the development of these projects, and this can include roads, ports, IT systems, renewable energy supply to the projects. And the 5th pillar is about capacity building, training, and skills that are absolutely essential to the partner country, in particular if they have the ambition to go further down in the value chain, so that they need this training and capacity building to be able to form the workforce to more developed and advanced projects. So this is a nutshell, in a nutshell, the basic concept of the partnerships. So when we set the partnership with a third country, it is usually implemented through a memorandum of understanding that is an unbinding instrument. It's signed on behalf of the EU. And what is the most important about these partnerships is the roadmap with actions that we agree with the third country together to develop these actions to achieve the objectives we set in the partnership. And when we set these objectives, the objectives are based on mutual interest, because all the actions that go into this roadmap are to be for mutual benefit of the EU and of the third country. And through this roadmap, we can also set actions as dialogues for improvement of governance or ESG criteria, or reinforcement of environmental legal frameworks, but what we do not do is to impose actions to the third country. Everything is mutually agreed and implemented together. And then what we do is to monitor the implementation of the roadmaps and to revisit it when the time comes and to agree on new actions to continue our cooperation together. So far, the only roadmap that we had revisited was with Canada, because it was the first partnership, and here the time frame for each roadmap, it depends from country to country, because we don't have a standard format. We have an approach, but because this is agreed together with the partner country, we don't impose, of course, any specific formula. So each one then will have its specificities that are very much based on the interests of the partner country as well. So maybe I will stop here, and of course I will be happy to reply to any questions. Thank you for the attention.
Thank you very much. I think this has been a very clear introduction to what the partnerships are and to what they are not. What did your ESG criteria? ESG?
Environmental, social, and governance. I am sorry.
Voilà. No, just for clarity. Thank you very much. Then I think we stay within the EU institutions, but we go to the European Parliament with the second speaker, with Sergi Corbalan, advisor on international trade for the Greens EFA group in the Parliament.
That's right. So thanks, Jan, and I'm happy to be here. So the Critical Raw Materials Act, which was adopted by Parliament and Council, of course, includes many improvements in relation to the having no act, right? And I think that before there were strategies of the Commission and of the EU in relation to raw materials, because we see them as being based on access to raw materials, whereas the Critical Raw Materials Act brings an element of resilience, which was a dimension that wasn't there as much, which is very much welcome, of course, circularity, sustainability. So I think it is an improvement, of course, and we are proud of what we adopted with the Council. Yet, from our parliamentary group, of course, it's not perfect either. I mean, some of the things that our group wanted to see more present in the Act was looking at the problem of demand. So I think that is kind of the blind spot, basically. We're not, the sufficiency dimension is not really taken into account. The resilience, yes, but actually looking at, okay, we can, of course, recycle as much as possible. We can develop partnerships. That's all positive. Yet we also need to look at maybe targets of reduction of material consumption in the EU. Otherwise, we will not achieve the kind of change that we need, and we are in this challenge. We're in a problem altogether here, and I want to highlight this message of course, we want to promote the green transition and clean tech. That creates enormous pressure on critical raw materials. So we are in the same problem. So let's work together to find solutions to address that, right? Anyway. Also, we would have expected more prominent recognition of the free prior informed consent for affected populations in projects. It is mentioned somehow, kind of, but it's not as prominently as we would have wished. Yet, I think that the policy is good, and now we need to make sure that the implementation of this policy is done in a way that we cannot be accused of neo-colonialist, exploitative policy. It's certainly not the intention, but of course you know that we are already victims of criticism by partners on other pieces of legislation, so we need to make sure that this isn't the case this time. So for that, we need to maybe really look at what are the really, I think if we want to be not neo-colonial, is like, what are the real interests of the other of our partners, and how can we work together to achieve them, right? And again, and I think that certainly the strategic partners are a very good step in that direction. Of course, it's also that there is a strategic partnerships, but there's other kind of parallel measures that are being discussed. With some countries, there's raw materials and energy chapters in free trade agreements that are being discussed. So for example, when it comes to Chile, for example, so there's some additional provisions that those are clearly legally binding, and those is something that deserves attention. So because they can also undermine the policy space of the trading country to put in place certain measures that maybe, if we only look at it from a selfish access to raw materials, maybe look bad, but if we look at the long term and geopolitically as well, well, I guess the question that we need to ask as well is that how do we make sure that not only we de-risk from China, but how do we become attractive, trusted, interesting partners for the other countries so that we have long-term relationships with them, right? So I think we need to go in that direction, and I would even call it like a raw materials diplomacy strategy, let's say, that makes an interesting offer to the trading partner. And that could be many things, and some of them are already covered in the strategic partnerships offers the administrative space to discuss these things. But there are important things like technology transfer that maybe is more than only capacity building. Looking at investment, for example, right? I mean, very often the trading partners, they say, well, yes, you now ask all these ESG standards, but what's in for us? Because otherwise we could do it like in the normal way, and then we sell it to somebody else, right? So how can we channel EU member states? That's maybe more the global gateway kind of thing, but also private investment. And what can we do? And I'm really asking that, so that maybe the countries get kind of an interesting offer from us, and they see, okay, the EU needs our materials, they do have standards, but it's interesting for us to work with them because we get investment, we will get access to a new market. I mean, this would be hopefully the kind of discussions that we would be hoping that happen. For that, and this is nobody's fault, by the way, and it's an area in development, but we see it from our group, like there is a lack of sufficient coordination between the services of the Commission, because everybody pulls in their own direction. INPA has budget, GROW has the lead on strategic partnership, there is trade and so on, and there we don't see it too clear. But maybe the opportunity of a new Commission is an opportunity maybe to maybe clarify that and promote further cooperation. There is also an issue of transparency, I think, that needs to be improved. Again, this is nobody's specifically fault, and I think that a lot of officials would agree. But for example, as far as I'm aware, you mentioned that even more important than the strategic partnerships are the roadmaps, but these are not made public, unless I get it wrong. Also, like the Parliament didn't appreciate that, for example, the memorandum of understanding with Rwanda that was presented to Council and in a Council working group and wasn't presented to the Parliament and until we requested, but that was too late. It was after the adoption. So that, I think we see it as a problematic thing where the Commission should inform the co-legislators equally before the strategic partnerships are drafted. And as you know, in Belgium and the Netherlands, there was quite a lot of uproar in civil society and human rights institutions in relation to the Rwanda case, because basically it is common knowledge that Rwanda doesn't have so many production, I would say, in itself, but there is a lot of illegally smuggled minerals from Congo, from the Kivu region. So basically signing an MOU with Rwanda is almost incentivizing a continuation of the regional conflict and illegal smuggling of minerals. So ignoring that it's of course a mistake in our view, and these are the kind of things that we should, I think, be as Parliament and Council presented before these are done, so that we as EU have indeed strategic partnerships and good win-win diplomacy with raw materials rich countries, but of course not at any price. Not there needs to be for us in our group in any case. Human rights and sustainability are not an additional nice to have, but they're a precondition, I would say, to have meaningful win-win partnerships. I think I will leave it there, and then happy to continue the discussions after.
Thank you very much, Sergi. That is a very interesting perspective, and also interesting that you point out the coherence dimension within the institution and decision making, and maybe the possibilities of the new commission. So we might also discuss that later when we have time. But now let's skip to the third speaker. Bosisi Ngouba is a professor at the University of Antwerp and also at the Université Catholique de Bukavu, and he will be joining online. So technology allows. Bosisi, you have the floor.
Yes, can you hear me?
Perfect.
Great. So my intervention will go in an even more critical direction than the previous speaker. For me, there is an inherent. So the intentions are good to change the situation. That is that we both, all the three of us, agree on. However, I find that the foundation of the intervention is likely to not to lead it to some challenges. So one thing is there is a certain conundrum in the word raw material and some of the objectives. It's very difficult to think of a policy that is built to access or to have raw material and then think of we need the supply chain to be as advanced as possible, because the fact that it's about raw material, this other aspect of allowing local
Can you, sorry, can you hear me?
What is actually proven to be
we don't hear you well, Bosisi. Can you hear us now? You were interrupted. So if you hear me, if maybe you could start again. I'm sorry, from what you were saying about the problem in your view that it starts with raw materials. Why and how that is an issue.
Okay, I hope this is a bit better.
Yes.
So yeah, I was saying the concept itself, like the very huge problems that we have been noticing in Congo, mostly where I've been working, and I think it's in many other African countries. So it's very difficult to say this act aims at not being neo-colonial, while it's still about looking at Africa as a place where we get raw materials, not as a place where there is technological development and Africans are no longer needing to go to Europe to buy things. So this circle where things are extracted in Africa, it doesn't matter how far they are cleaned within the supply chain, it's still raw materials, because there is no plan to say EU consider buying 20%, 10%, whichever percent of its batteries or EV from a country like Congo that has most of the minerals that are needed to produce this. So as far as the idea is to have the material, the manufacturing, the value making is there for the EU businesses. I think it's neo-colonial to talk about avoiding to support the conflicts that are happening there. It's quite difficult to reach this objective. And what I was saying is that the highest chance is that we have actually a very huge text in which you have almost all the niceties, but in terms of its implementation, it will lead to the same results that we have had before with rubber and with the problems that Congo has undergone the last 3 decades, where it's really about getting the copper out, getting the gold out, and the same for so many. So for me, it's like there is a need to really not change slightly some paragraph in the text, but rethink the whole thing. Is the EU ready to consider these resource-rich countries as partners, equal partners, not as countries in need of help, to which some capacity building, to have targets where these countries can be led with all the businesses of the EU that operate there, that have Congo somewhere in their supply chain, to put condition which will lead Congo at least to produce the batteries Congo needs in the first place, but also to be able to import, not all of it, but to a certain percentage, finished goods that can be sold to the market at their highest value, not things that represent 5 or 10% of the lowest value. So that is one thing. The other thing that is very important to take into account is when these things need to be made, if they are not made by the weakest members of the supply chain. By that, I mean the poorest and the most marginalized miners. So there can be all these restrictions. Things have to be environmentally sustainable, but if the country is not provided enough resources, if you don't change things right, it means the miner will have to go through extra administrative processes to sell the very little. So he was already in poverty. He is likely to be pushed toward extreme poverty. And the final point I would like to make, this in-depth change of the approach of the EU, especially in this demographic transition, is not only good for Congo. So it's not only that Congo, Africa, and this resource-rich country needs the EU to change this. Also, some of the problem that the EU is dealing with now are likely to worsen, and this can help mitigate that. By that, I mean, when you have climate change, no matter how much the Green Revolution can offset, there will still be some climate change. And this will create scarcity, wars, and large waves of migrations. So by trying to create more capacity, more wealth, and change a bit the distribution of wealth, there is a way in which the heat of the climate change will not be harder for population within the EU to manage, because some of the countries that will have a certain wealth will be within the global south, will also be able to take up a portion of people who are suffering of the damage of the climate change. So with the current change in political regime in the EU, I see that as more of an opportunity. If the new parties that are going to rule really want to solve this problem and not just use it as their political cow milk, there is really opportunity here to really capacitate Congo, Angola, and all these countries to create hubs of manufacturing, the EU committing to buying some of these goods, the EU committing to helping this country produce for themselves, not just helping the European businesses that have always gone to the global south, extract, manufacture, send back, and change this model. I think there is opportunity to solve some of these big problems that we are foreseeing over the next decade. So I think I will first stop there, and maybe I can react later on the.
All right, thank you very much, Bosisi, for this very valuable contribution, and indeed inspiring us to think maybe about different kinds of models, right, and about more deeper rethinking. Then we have Robin Roos. Robin is the EU Raw Materials Coalition Coordinator.
Yes, thank you, Jan, and happy to be here also as a Ghent University alumni. It's good, and even though it's the VUB, it's also a bit coming home in a way. So nice to meet everyone. So I am Robin Roos, indeed the coordinator of the EU Raw Materials Coalition. We are a coalition that came into existence about 3 years ago, when we got word that indeed on the EU level there would be an initiative to kind of tackle some of the issues that were already explained by Helena and then also by some of the other speakers in terms of the sourcing of the raw materials, both domestically but also in the context of the strategic partnership. So we formed a coalition of civil society organizations from various backgrounds, environmental, human rights, but also children's rights, anti-corruption, etc. Also North-South and global partnerships collaboration. So a lot of organizations also with members in respective countries, be it the DRC or Indonesia or Chile, Argentina, Bolivia, when it comes to lithium, for example. And we have been active, particularly strongly on, of course, the Critical Raw Materials Act and the strategic partnerships, which have also already been actually created and forged also parallel to the negotiations that were going on with the Critical Raw Materials Act. So it's good to know that these were already, to a large extent, also in the pipeline. So when it comes to what was kind of our direction with what's happening in terms of the critical raw materials, I think a lot of aspects were already mentioned. But just to say that for us also one of the main points has always been and will be to also question again the demand of these critical raw materials, specifically within the European context. What do we mean by this? Well, when it comes to looking at the projections which have been made, among others by the GRC, by the European Commission, but also by some of the industry groups here in Brussels, as to what we will be needing in terms of raw materials for our energy transition. But let's also be clear, not just for our energy transition when we talk about critical raw materials. It's also about the defense industry. It's also about space exploration. These are also included in that basket, but often it's only mentioned that we are talking about the green transition because this is kind of like, the common objective and the common goal that we can agree upon, but it's also important to pay attention to that aspect. What is not being taken into consideration within those projections is, on one hand, how are we going to apply these technologies and for what purposes do they serve? And I think what is one of the main things that we push forward there is to say we need to focus on, in the coming decades, what we need within the European Union in terms of services rather than particular raw materials for particular technologies. Take, for example, mobility. I mean, what is the objective? It's to get people around in their cities, in their countries, across the EU. The objective is not to give everyone a private electric vehicle. So what can we do more also on these fundamental levels? And mobility is not the only sector. It's also about electronics, it's about housing, it's about buildings, and other raw material intensive industries and applications within our societies. Why do we need to look in this? On one hand, of course, for the environmental impacts that come with extractive industries, but also down the supply chain. I mean, we are not only in a climate crisis, we are also in a pollution crisis, in a biodiversity crisis. And we need to be very careful where we tread. Of course, we've seen positive developments with the EU Green Deal, but from our coalition out, we also advocate for caution. The second one is global access and distribution of resources. I think there were already some interesting points made, also a bit tapping into what is the way forward, but also looking back a bit to what happened in the past and not to repeat the mistakes of the past, I think is very important. And there is among civil society consensus that there is a substantial risk of repeating some of those mistakes from the past. So why is this so important? Not, of course, only for the development of those countries respectively and their industries, but also in terms of the distribution of these resources and the accessibility for them also to decarbonize and not only to monopolize it within our respective countries to do this decarbonization, because if we make it hard to afford or make access to these raw materials finished technological products harder within those countries, this was also set us back again. When it comes to what is needed in order for these things to happen within a certain context of agreement, I think it's very important the local communities and also to a large extent indigenous peoples, because more than 50% of transition minerals are found in the indigenous peoples' lands, is to respect free, prior and informed consent and community consent within those contexts, not consultation, not just acceptance. These are insufficient within that context. And that is very important because these partnerships, if we're moving really to the external dimension now, can only succeed if there is equal amount of trust on both sides. And this will have to imply civil society involvement on both sides, civil society in those respective countries, but also here in Europe. We already have a network where we collaborate, and we are very eager with the European Commission, with other stakeholders, with the institutions to really foster this dialogue on the roadmaps on how we can create value addition. But also we have clear lines on when it comes to the aspect of consent, which implies that both sides say yes. There are instances, there are occasions where certain projects really would come to a large disadvantage, both in terms of environmental and social impacts to local communities. And I think it is important to be honest and fair also when these projects go too far to look towards other possibilities and other projects in other places. This trust is really important. I believe that now we see this also, for example, in international negotiations. We were also recently involved within the UNEA 6 process, where there were also discussions around metals and minerals management, that there is a large distrust between some of the countries where mining is happening and the objectives really of the European Union. Sorry? You were saying? Sorry, UNEA 6. So the United Nations Environmental Assembly is a multilateral forum where also resolutions around metals and minerals mining, but also aspects such as circular economy have been discussed. But we see that I think it is very important to really continue this dialogue for the EU to be very proactive together with civil society, and to also not shy away from sometimes giving a bit more than taking, also taking into consideration the history. When it comes to, for example, also the financing, I think this has been really all throughout the process with CRMA that indeed there has been a lot of initiative to how can we push this forward, setting deadlines, setting targets, but also building in assurances. There will be a need for more financing in order for this to succeed. But what our point is there is that it's not mainly, or it's not directly about the financing of the industries themselves directly, but it is about the financing for the capacity in order to do these environmental and social impact assessments adequately, to make sure that they have the possibility to implement the best available techniques and to avoid social conflict within the context of these projects, be they extractive or further down the supply chain. Yes, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Robin. That was, again, an interesting perspective. Also very much on the procedures and the consent and how to accommodate that. Our next speaker is Ruth Lambrechts from UNCOR.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to also say a few words as Umicore. Umicore is a circular materials technology company. What do we mean with materials? It's basically because we add functionality to metals. That is, for instance, we add functionalities to platinum group metals in catalysts that are used in clean air, and battery materials we convert into cathode active materials used in electric vehicles. These are just a few examples. We are also circular, so that also means that we recycle these metals or materials, because that is also the advantage of metals, that they can be endlessly recyclable without losing any of their properties, which is of course a big difference with fossil fuels, because you combust them, they emit CO2, and then it's gone, and we have all the... So let's not forget that this is also a discussion about an alternative for the current way of extraction of fossil fuels that is, I would say, the business as usual, and has also its challenges for many of the things that we discussed here. I said it already, a few examples. I think a very important in this discussion is that not all critical raw materials are the same. So there's one Critical Raw Materials Act, but we as a company, we have many activities in critical raw materials. We have, for instance, in Belgium, in Antwerp, the largest precious metals recycling plant, which is recycling and recovering precious metals like platinum, rhodium, iridium, that are also used in hydrogen applications and catalysts, from different sources of waste, but also from byproducts of mines. So byproducts of mines worldwide that nobody can use and would otherwise be landfilled, we can recover the precious metals. The amount of recycling efficiency of that business of Umicore is already more than 80%. So it's already ticking the boxes of the Critical Raw Materials Act. Other activities are less mature. For instance, battery materials are already raised. This is, of course, a business where still a lot of things are in development, and where we also face big competition from Asia, from China. So where we where we ask really for a kickstart in Europe, and where the Critical Raw Materials Act can provide an example. But there are also other, and that's maybe an interesting point to raise, because it's a new project from Umicore. We also have a very niche business like electro-optic materials, which is mainly using germanium applications. Germanium, maybe you don't know what it is, but it's, for instance, if you have your Face ID on your mobile phone, it's using germanium. Germanium is also being used, for instance, in solar panels in space. So it's a very specific material that is mostly refined and recycled in China. But in Europe, we are the biggest refiner and recycler. And we have also recently concluded a long-term partnership agreement with STL, which is a subsidiary of Gécamines in DRC, where we valorize germanium from the Big Hill tailing site. So it's also old mining residues that are now being valorized, and where we exactly are a technology partner for STL or the Gécamines, in order to produce material solutions, but it also helps us to diversify our access to raw materials, because I think that is also very important for companies. And it was, of course, also supported by the European Commission services. But I do want to raise that this Critical Raw Materials Act, it provides a very good framework for investments. It provides, if it really materializes like that, also concrete timelines on permitting. But in itself, it will not trigger investments, because in the end, it's companies that will make sure that there are critical raw materials projects. And therefore, we lack also one important element in the entire Critical Raw Materials Act, and that's funding. Because if EU companies don't find a business case to do these type of investments in critical raw materials, others will do it. And maybe a few, I think it was yesterday in the press, BASF and Eramet, which could be considered as competitors of Umicore, they had a project to do cobalt and nickel refining in Indonesia, and they have yesterday announced that they would stop it because there is already enough capacity. Capacity from who? 100% almost Chinese companies. So I think it is this framework that has been adopted, and very fast adopted, to which I congratulate the Parliament, the Council, and the Commission for having this. It also needs to really make sure that we, as European companies, have also a level playing field, and so that there is also really that we have. Otherwise, we would be still be really dependent for specific sources from elsewhere. Maybe in terms of trade policy, I think it is one of the critical raw materials partnerships. It's a carrot more, but I also want to highlight that I think also the EU has also many sticks in terms of relations with resource-rich countries. Just to be sure, we are not against these policy measures like a CBAM or a deforestation ban or a forced labor ban, not at all. But they do put a stress on trade relations with rich countries. And I think we also have to bring some carrots. If we talk, for instance, about forced labor or even deforestation, we are a company that has a large history. We were a long time ago a mining company, but we now have many policies in place for responsible sourcing with various certifications, with many policies on due diligence and environmental, also and ESG guarantees. For instance, also the project in DRC with GKMIN. But the goal is also, or the challenge is also to make sure that we can valorize this, because we can be the best in class company if we import electric vehicles, for instance, where the cobalt is being mined by other competitors that do not at all consider these considerations. Yeah, then we have another good business case. So I think the challenge is really also to bring this sustainability criteria also to the end consumer. And if we can do that, and that is, I think, basically the goal of the EU battery regulation and the idea of digital product passports in the EU, if we can bring that also to end consumers and to valorize all the efforts that companies do in Europe, then we might have a game changer. And that is not a trade policy instrument, because it started with your question, what is trade? But it's maybe also an important element to consider, because it's a more positive instrument. And we are really, we are really working on that one. It can be the blueprint for any product that is being brought in the European market, for which different types of sustainability criteria are being considered.
Thank you very much. That is very clear and interesting to hear how, from an industry perspective, this CRMA can be situated, and also how indeed it can be widened to other issues like the battery regulation, the digital passport, etc. Then last but not least, of course, we have Sarah Katz-Lavigne, who is professor at the University of Antwerp.
Postdoc, but yeah.
Postdoc. In Belgium, that's the same. I did not have the institute here. In my
Institute of Development Policy.
Yes,
IOD. Yeah, so thank you very much. So I just want to provide maybe a bit more of a granular view on some of the issues that have been raised already. So the participation, the partnerships, and I'm coming to this from the project that I'm currently working on, which is Driving Change, and now IFOMIN, which is kind of like an add-on to do some more on-the-ground outreach and information work with the artisanal miners in a range of roles and tasks in the supply chain. So basically, this is a project that at the inception really tried to make sense of all of the initiatives and frameworks and standards that exist or have been created around both the 3 TGs in Eastern Congo, but also increasingly in the cobalt mining space with the cobalt boom, and huge interest in issues like child labor or some of these more visible violations and issues. So while this is a space where there isn't really like a legal framework the way that you see with like the conflict minerals regulation in the EU, this is actually probably something where there's more guidance. So like the OECD due diligence guidance is obviously like a big influential piece in the different initiatives that have arisen around cobalt and trying to address some of those perceived issues. Yeah. So basically, we found that there are just a really wide range of multiplying initiatives, trying to do some monitoring or trying to, indeed implement the traceability or the due diligence components. There are a number of initiatives as well in the child labor space, which has recently again been in the news with very large numbers of child labor participants being cited by the UN, for instance. And you can talk about the numbers because it's also very tricky to find out like what is actually going on in these mines, as we've also discovered. But essentially, we're trying to understand the extent to which all of these artisanal and small-scale miners are actually able to understand, participate in, be consulted on all of these projects and initiatives in the different mine sites. And while there's very often kind of an idealized portraits of what a miner looks like, so typically a male miner, someone who goes down into the pit, of course, it's quite well known that women are a very important part of these supply chains. Since we're talking in terms of supply chains, they do a large number of tasks and play a large number of roles, but often as well are not really taken into consideration. Because, for instance, on the partnership front, there is an emphasis on working with cooperatives, which typically are like elite-dominated structures, and are more focused on the actual men who mine or do the actual extractive work, rather than the women who typically process or provide like indirect services or support services. So that was definitely something that really came across, as was the lack of information, understanding, especially for the ordinary men and women miners, to even understand, well, what are some of these like multi-stakeholder initiatives that are coming? What are these government and United Nations actors kind of trying to do in the child labor space? Who are some of the funders behind this as well? Because it became clear that some of these multi-stakeholder initiatives or other initiatives often are funded by corporate actors who are not necessarily very visible, or are trying to maybe avoid being as visible because, for them, for those reasons of those violations that have been highlighted, it can be quite bad for publicity to be seen as being involved in or funding some of these efforts. And so, certainly we found, I think like some of the discussions of like top-down measures, this is not necessarily being addressed or altered in any meaningful way, as Bosisi already drew attention to. So that also brings us to some of these colonial continuities of really like market priorities or international priorities that are to a large extent imposed, albeit in some sort of participation or partnership. But I would say it's quite an elite-driven project. So whether at the international level or at the level of like the cooperatives themselves, these are not really cooperatives that empower the actual miners, the ordinary laborers, the day workers kind of thing, in a sense that one would like to see. And then certainly a focus on a certain type of profile, as I mentioned. One thing that's become very clear is that previous mineral rushes and policy approaches, such as with the conflict minerals in Eastern Congo, there were some steps or measures taken to try to improve some of that engagement and to take artisanal miners into greater consideration. So as I mentioned, like seeing cooperatives in a much more, as more of a partner, trying to really say, well, we don't want to do anything that the cooperatives themselves are not proposing or that is not considered by them to be a priority, which is, I think, valuable, important role, but can also be quite problematic in the local context. So there's really an emphasis increasingly on like legitimate mining, which tends to be really the focus on legal mining or mining in legalized or formalized spaces. And these are extremely difficult to come by and very much under pressure from a lot of, so if we're talking in terms of supply chain competitors, we can say that the artisanal miners are very much being squeezed out of having participation in any sense, because in most cases they're typically operating in very legally or formally questionable, I guess, contacts. So often on industrial mining companies' concessions, which puts them in a very fragile or vulnerable position for being removed or expelled later. So that's also a tricky one. And then this emphasis on legitimacy, really, well, who is a legitimate miner? It can be very much identified or defined from the outside by market actors. And then really at different levels, we also found that, as mentioned, kind of the downstream buyers, the international consultancies or the initiatives that are trying to clean up some of these issues are tend to overlook some of the priorities that really are the concern of the everyday miner. So things that we heard repeatedly about the pricing of the minerals, about the monopoly purchasing arrangements, the emphasis on certain risks that are really more about, again, the public relations of certain corporate actors or downstream buyers, rather than about the actual day-to-day living environment and concerns of those miners, and that women's considerations also are very infrequently taken into account. So things like the prices and the ability of ordinary miners to sell their minerals at a fair price, certainly not sufficiently discussed. The access to sites to mine in a context of immense pressure under of mostly industrial and corporate and large-scale mining actors is also another issue that doesn't sufficiently get taken into account. So this suggests that, in the context of EU-DRC partnership, there's a need to pay attention really to those kinds of hierarchies and power relationships, and to understand that, ordinary miners themselves are not really being taken into consideration in this picture. Even when they're told or they're incorporated, it tends to be quite selectively. So they are sort of informed of like, well, these are the risks you need to watch out for. You need to make sure that you're wearing your personal protective equipment. You need to make sure that you're preventing any children from working here, or that pregnant women may not have access. But it's very much sort of like we are defining the priorities from above. So there's really a need to have a much more significant debate of, well, what are some of their priorities, and how can those be taken into account in kind of redefining these relationships in a way that CC also drew attention to. And sorry, I think that's about it for now.
Right.
Thank you.
That was again an interesting perspective, especially with the emphasis also that you put on the ordinary miners and their experiences from your research. This means that you have all been very diligent and very disciplined, also in terms of sticking to the 10 minutes. Thank you very much for that. It means we have some time for questions and answers. Maybe before we open the floor, also for the people online, maybe I would like to give you the opportunity, just if you want to make a quick reaction or to do a quick intervention on each other's contribution, because I imagine you've been listening to each other. So maybe there's a few responses or questions that you might have within the panel. If not, yes, Ruth.
One thing I wrote down. I think, of course, the idea of the Critical Raw Materials Act and also the Net Zero Industry Act is to have also a Green Deal industrial plan, that we do not lose our clean tech industry and our clean materials industry in Europe, and that we import products that do not have the same standards as we do. So the question and the discussion that you raised on demand reduction and resource efficiency, I think it really deserves a discussion, but it cannot be used as an excuse to not have the discussion on, do we want to build an industrial value chain on batteries, on raw materials, on hydrogen, or do we want to import these products from elsewhere where they might not have the same standards? And I think you can discuss, of course, the numbers, but for instance, the study from KU Leuven says lithium amount for the green transition times 20, cobalt times 4, nickel times 2, copper times 4. You can discuss whether it should be times 4 or times 3, but it is a multiplier effect. So it definitely deserves a discussion, but I think it should not be used as the main reaction to the Critical Raw Materials Act, because it's really also about building our own industrial value chain, or just losing our industrial basis and importing the products from elsewhere. That was just one reaction.
Can I quickly comment there?
Yes, of course.
Okay. Yes, no, thanks, Judith. And I think we do agree on this. The matter is just that what we're trying to say is that we have to do it really under the best and the highest circumstances in terms of environmental and social governance. And then we also have to look into reduction in tandem. We know that the extraction of materials and the demand will grow. But the question is to what extent?
Yeah.
And how do we find the middle way in that to assure that others also have access in other parts of the world to those raw materials and to those finished products for their development on one hand, and also to make sure that we don't overconsume ourselves, because with I think it is about 7% of the world population. We're using currently 30% of the world's resources. And it's something we really have to think about. I mean, and this accumulation is not something that happened now in 2024. It has happened over the past hundreds and hundreds of years under, I would say, very different political circumstances. But assessing that and also acknowledging that we're not just talking about combating climate change, but we're talking about how to build a sustainable, although I have some remarks on the terminology. I think it often ends up being a bit of a container concept, but a kind of sustainable or kind of manageable economy, modern society, which has technology, which also really values the resources that goes into them and really applies them in a way that is high tech in the sense of high tech of like how can we do the most with the least. This is very important.
Yes, I think also Bosisi wanted to react to that, and then we have Sergi. Maybe briefly. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I wanted to react to what Ruth previously said about the financing. So for me, there is an opportunity that have been proven in many other sectors where laws can push private people and businesses to adopt a different attitude, as long as the change is not too huge for them to bear. As much as you have laws saying there is a need to diversify the supply chain, there is a need to recycle. Probably if you would ask business to make choice by themselves, they would have one source, all extraction, and never consider the recycling, which may be more costly, or other sources. At the same way, there can be laws if there is really intention to say every company, every operator must manufacture, add value locally. This being compulsory, this being maybe 10%, 15, 20%, at something where the change is not too much for them to bear, if there is this intention, can create actual change on the ground. As I was mentioning recently, when you work with miners, they are not in that job because they enjoy it or because it's a very difficult job. They know it. They want other types of job. They sometimes have skills, education that could allow them to go for other types of jobs, but these jobs don't exist because the only model is about extracting and their resources being taken away. So for me, and I think Robin mentioned this, as much as we can think of, do we just need cobalt and battery and cars? We need people to move. That's the actual need. I think we also need to think of the people. Like Sergi just said, 7% consume almost everything. Can we think of people as a global, even though the laws will be made for EU, but can we really have the observation and the problematization includes everybody? Everybody needs transportation, electricity, no smoke with firewoods that give them disease for cooking their food, and all these things. Can you think of this? And then when we make such an important piece of legislation like the Critical Raw Material Act, to be sure we are contributing toward attaining this goal over 50 years, 100 years. We may have a word that is a bit different from the one we all are angry about. But if we just, we don't take this into account, we will really have these very nice phrases, but which have no enforcement, no potential for provoking actual change, and which really do not take into account the need of the people who live there. And the most vulnerable, the ones who suffer the most, are even the most excluding, and we will end up where we started in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you. Sergi, I think you also wanted to react?
Yes, but very briefly, just also because on the demand issue, but Robin has already made a very good point. I just want to make it linked to a topic that is being linked to this, which is what is the EU needs to become competitive. This is the new frame now, and Mario Draghi will present a report soon, and I mean, by listening to the different parties, it seems to me that where the policy attention should be is in making EU and EU actors more competitiveness in doing more with less material inputs, right? So I think, and that's I think all directions should be going into that direction. So when it comes to funding, for example, so that should be the top priority. So the issue, therefore, is not putting China against. So the priority for me is not to activate the card of the fear of the competition of other geographical areas, because we're all in it together in a way. I mean, I know we need to correct unfair trading practices for sure, but at the same time, it's about at least the private sector is always a strong defender of competition, and you know that you get stronger if you compete. Let's put in place measures that incentivize competition in offering products that are useful for the citizen, using as little material, new raw materials, let's say primary raw materials as possible, and therefore these both when produced or recycled in the EU, but also of course in the trading countries, right, the partner countries.
Yeah, so I guess 2 key points of response. So one would be then, who are the partners that the EU wants? And if it's serious about partnership, is that only at the national level? Because that then runs the risk of like a real underrepresentation or not taking into account these important subnational actors. And of course, I highlighted particularly the men and women who really are an unsurmountable part of the chain, who really do the I mean, it's dirty work. So literally the dirty work of extracting those minerals, and especially as a crucial source of flexible additional supply and adapting to price changes and so on. And so what, if that is the case, well then, to what extent is there time for discussion, debate, deliberation when everything is being presented as such a crucial and timely and high pressure, you know, we have to act immediately or China will be there 10 steps ahead. And then, yeah, in a similar vein, I mean, if actors are serious about improving the lives of these ordinary miners, then there has to be much more discussion about the share, the distribution of the resources to those who are, yeah, in many cases, literally making it possible to take all these additional steps in the supply chain. So how can those labor costs be built in? Like, so in the projects, we've seen projects, for instance, that are just shut down when the prices fall because there's no more economic incentive. Well, then, you know, maybe there needs to be a discussion around tackling corporate profits or some other things before taking away those basic safeguards as soon as it becomes perceived to be prohibitively expensive. So yeah, I think those are the 2 key points that I would say in response. Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you. Well, the issue is certainly complex, and it has many dimensions that have been raised here. We could be seated around this table for weeks discussing the many dimensions and the complexity of the raw material supply chains and the challenges we face in the world. I will try to focus my reactions on what is the subject of this particular meeting here, that are the partnerships, but I do not resist to react to the need to reduce consumption. And I just would like to say that the EU policy goes also into that direction. So resource efficiency has been a constant target in the EU policy. And we invest many millions of euros in research and innovation, precisely in view of reducing consumption of raw materials. So I don't resist to, although this is not directly linked with the subject of the partnerships here. On the subject of the partnerships, I would maybe like to react to the criticism of Wassini that says that starting from the name, it lacks partnerships on raw materials, it lacks coherence, and I would like to stress here that precisely these are not partnerships on raw materials, but on raw materials value chains. Because, as I said from the beginning, these are not partnerships on mining. It's on the entire value chain and can even combine other sectors and manufacturing. And for example, on the case of the DRC, we are very well aware of the ambition DRC has to build a battery value chain. And one of the interactions we have been having there is precisely with the Battery Council. But this is not something that is built from one day to the other. So DRC is traditionally a mining country. It has to build the full value chain up, down, to refining before it goes into the conditions to build the batteries. So, and to get there, it needs to have the necessary skills, skilled workforce to go into that direction. So this is a long process. This is not, it will drive structural change. That's our level of ambition with these partnerships, in particular for developing countries, that they will drive structural change, but this takes time to achieve. One country cannot go from today of being a mining country with most of the mining being of ASM mining to produce a battery. This is a long process, but this is very much in our minds when we design the roadmaps of this partnership. So I just would like to make this point. On the we are very much aware of the challenges of the ASM process, and we are very keen to engage on that front, but again, it takes time. It requires a pilot project to show that change can be done and that all the workers around it have a role, and that even the change comes, it will be in the benefit of everyone. So, but first we need to start small and then to grow. Because if we want to go and change everything at the same time, it will not work. And for those who are so concerned with the neo-colonialism approach, we need to keep in mind that we need to work with the country. And we cannot arrive to the country imposing governance models. So we need time to drive the changes. So this is the message I would like to leave here, given some of the more negative side I heard about the partnerships. And if I am allowed, just one last point. The EU is not the only global player that is looking for raw materials from these countries. There are many global players doing so. And our concern through the partnerships is to, and again, now I am speaking more towards the developing countries, is to support these countries to deal with the pressure they will be exposed, driven by this increasing demand. Because what worries us is not only the projects that the EU will be developing there. When I say the EU, it's the EU stakeholders, the EU industry, member states, and the investments that will be there, because those we expect that follow the same level of environmental, social, and governance standards when we develop projects in the EU. But we see other global partners that do not do this. And what our intention is to provide the partner countries the necessary tools for them to deal with all this pressure, also from other global competitors that do not follow the same ESG standards as the EU does. So, thank you.
Thank you. Well, that leaves us with 10 minutes for a wider discussion.
Sorry.
It's very fine. I think that was a really interesting exchange, actually. It's okay. I don't necessarily have to be on the screen because we want to give the floor to the audience, right? So I'm looking around here in Brussels, but also online, of course. I guess that people can raise their hand digitally if they have any questions or comments. And I would ask to very, very briefly introduce yourself and also try to, to be brief in your question or comments.